This week we're going to be taking a look at a GREX airbrush. This is the Tritium TS3. The first thing that you probably notice is that bright green grip and the pistol style trigger. I've heard a lot of good things about this airbrush. It always looked pretty cool to me, so naturally I had to pick it up. And so before we begin, the same old disclaimer, I do not work with or for any airbrush company or any paint company. Like always, I purchased this one with my own money to keep myself entirely independent. If I don't pay for a product, I don't make a video on it. I paid $178 and $15 tax, so the total price of this came to $193. And I'll talk about how I feel about that pricing at the end of the video. There's a few different options for the Tritium airbrush. The one that I purchased is a side feed. Now personally, I'm happy with either a top gravity fed or a side fed airbrush, but I've always found that the side feed versions have a few advantages. Because the entire cup is removable, it's so nice to have that option to take it off of the airbrush and clean it out in the sink. And another nice feature is that you can angle that cup, so regardless of which way you're painting, you don't have to worry about paint spilling. So for example, if I'm painting on a flat surface, I could tilt the cup back, and if I need to paint above me for something like a ceiling mural, I can tilt that cup forward. This is going to be important for that smaller niche of people that need this, but it's just a nice option to have available. There is another version of this airbrush that comes with a standard gravity-fed cup, and so the choice is going to be up to you depending on your preferences. I like both styles, I'm happy with either, but if given the option, more often than not, I'm going to go with the side feed. I have to say that the packaging and the presentation of this airbrush is very nice, and you get a bunch of accessories with this one. Obviously, we have the airbrush, and you get 3 cups with this, which is always a very nice thing to see. There's the smaller cup, which is 7 mil, about 1/4 ounce. There's also a medium-sized one, which is 15 mil, about 1/2 ounce. And also included is a glass side siphon bottle. This one is much larger at 30 milliliters or 1 fluid ounce. I don't use that much paint as I'm working, so the 7 milliliter one is more than enough for me. But it's such a nice thing to have those larger cups included in the box. If I ever need them in the future, they're ready to go. There's also a small spanner wrench to remove the nozzle, as well as the quick fit crown needle cap. Now, I own a lot of different airbrushes, all with different types of needle guards. And hands down, I think GREX has the best design for these out of any brand out there. GREX uses magnets to hold the needle caps in place. I always paint with the needle cap off so that I could see the needle just for aiming and cleaning off tip dry. But if I want that needle cap on, all I have to do is place it on the front of the airbrush and that magnet is going to lock it right in place. It's a very strong magnet too, so this cap is not going anywhere unless I decide to remove it by hand. And then for storage, so that you don't lose it, they also included a small magnet on the back of the airbrush. And it's such a simple design, but it's effective and convenient, and I just love little things like this because it just shows some of the care and thought that manufacturers put into their airbrushes. Besides the standard cap that you see on the airbrush right now, you also get a crown needle cap. This one has 2 prongs to give you a clearer sight of the needle so you can clean off tip dry much easier, and it also gives some protection for that needle tip as well. It works with the magnets just like the other one, so you could store it on the back of the airbrush. The model that I bought is the Tritium TS3, which means that it comes with a 0.3 millimeter nozzle. And that's great for general spraying. You could do a lot with the 0.3. You can get plenty of detail by holding the airbrush close to the surface, and of course you could back off the substrate for blocking in larger areas. If you'd like, there's also options for a smaller 0.2 millimeter nozzle or a larger 0.5. The rear handle is simple, it has no cutaway, but on the back there is a preset adjustment knob. Some brands call these trigger stops or needle limiters, and what the purpose of this is to preset that trigger distance. So if you like to use these, the option is there. The cup that I'm showing here is the smallest one that comes in the packaging. It's 7 milliliters, and in order to connect it, it screws onto the body of the airbrush. Depending on your preference or whether you're a righty or a lefty, you can add this cup to either side of the airbrush. And the cup itself feels very well made to me. It feels robust and has some nice threads on it to screw down in place. In the hand, the airbrush feels great to me with that green ergonomic grip. It almost has this kind of like tackiness to it that makes it feel very secure in the hand. The airbrush has some decent weight to it, which is something that I really like. It's not heavy at all, but it just feels solidly built. Besides this model, I own 2 other pistol trigger style airbrushes, and neither one of those has a handle like this one. To me, this is just so much more comfortable to work with. The trigger itself also has a grip over the top of it, so you don't feel like your trigger finger is slipping. And of course, this is a double action airbrush, but the mechanics are a bit different from the standard top trigger models. On this GREX Tritium, you pull back a small amount and the airbrush only sprays air. It doesn't spray paint. That's action number 1, and if you continue pulling back on that trigger, the needle begins to retract from the nozzle, causing the airbrush to spray paint. And that, of course, is action number 2, so that's why it's called a double action. And the nice thing about this type of airbrush is that it's much easier to pick up and use because that trigger does all of the work for you, meaning that the airbrush always starts with air and ends with air. That's very important. From here, let's switch over to that macro lens so we can see the finish on this airbrush. Some of you have asked me what macro lens I use, so I'm just going to show it here. It's the Nikon Nikkor MC50. It's a 2.8. And this lens shows everything, so just understand that everything is going to be a bit exaggerated, but the finish on this is excellent. There are a few smudges on that finish from my fingerprints, but everything looks very good on the exterior of this airbrush. Unfortunately, one thing that I noticed is that the nozzle is slightly off center within the front of the airbrush. I hate to see this, but it's so subtle that I didn't notice any issue with it when I was spraying. Here's another shot of the nozzle with the airbrush rotated 180 degrees. Maybe I'm just being very nitpicky here, but to me this just seems like it's slightly out of alignment. But it is something that I noticed, so I wanted to show it within this video. The cup itself has a nice finish, very nice build quality to it, but the bottom of the cup seems pretty rough to me. There's a fair amount of abrasions and machining marks in there. It's not perfectly smooth. And that's the smaller paint cup, so if we move along to the larger one, you can see it's the same thing. The exterior and the interior of the cup is excellent, very nice finish. Just at the very bottom there, you have some machining marks. This is no big deal to me personally, but it is something that I noticed, so again, I just wanted to show it to you in this video. Like always, let's move along to a breakdown so that we can see the internals of this airbrush. The first thing that I'm doing here is unscrewing the paint cup from the right side of the airbrush. There's another screw on the left side of the airbrush, and like I mentioned before, if I unscrew this, I could place the cup on either side of the airbrush body. So if you paint with your left hand, you could add the screw on the right side and then screw in the cup on the left side. And just like that, you have a lefty version of this airbrush, so if you do paint with your left hand, you'll just have a clear line of sight to whatever it is that you're painting. After removing that cup and that screw again, I'm going to remove the rear handle by unscrewing it off the back of the airbrush. Then I could loosen up that needle chucking nut, which releases the needle, and I could slide it right out the back. I'll place that chucking nut to the side, and then I'll just grip this bit of knurling here and unscrew the spring case. It was a bit tight by hand, so I'm using a pair of soft jaw pliers here so that I don't mar up any of that surface. And just remember that everything on an airbrush should always be hand tight. Never use soft jaw pliers to tighten anything down. Once I remove that, you can see that it's 3 parts here: the spring, the needle chuck, and that housing itself. So it's a nice simple design. Inside the body of the airbrush there are a few more parts for the trigger itself, but I'm not going to remove them in this video. Then moving along to the front, we have that awesome magnetic needle cap. I'll remove that first, and then I'll just unscrew this nozzle cap. And once that's removed, you can see the nozzle itself. Now, this is a screw-in nozzle. I never took it off of this airbrush, and I'm not going to in this video. It's a nice nozzle. It seems very robust. If you need to remove this, like if you're swapping it out for a smaller or a larger one, or if you damage it, the wrench to remove it comes in the packaging. And so that's it, just a quick breakdown. You can see that when I screw everything back together, only doing it hand tight. Besides that nozzle alignment that I showed before on the bottom of the paint cup, everything else seems very well made and manufactured. The trigger response on this airbrush is excellent. It's very, very sensitive. Remember that it starts spraying air first, so you're going to have to build up some muscle memory to where it starts engaging the paint. The one thing that I noticed about this airbrush is that it tends to put out a very high volume of paint. If you pull a little bit too far back, it's going to flood the surface. Even at lower PSIs, this airbrush puts out paint very quickly. And that's actually what I bought it for. I didn't buy this one to paint detail with. I used it to paint out of focus backgrounds. I've been using it for some of my own work, not ones that I show here on YouTube, but this little chrome study that we did a few weeks ago on the channel is a perfect example of what I would use it for. For this background where I want an even, smooth value of black paint, this airbrush is going to be perfect for that. And for the consistency test, you could see as I'm spraying this line, it's doing a perfect job. There's no sort of skipping, no splattering of that paint. And again, because that trigger is so sensitive on this airbrush, I need to be careful not to pull it too far back, because again, it could put out a lot of paint very quickly, which is a very nice feature for this type of airbrush. Although this airbrush is certainly capable of spraying in decent detail, that's not what I bought it for. I think it excels at things like backgrounds or spraying in glazes of paint over a larger area. And that's what I'm doing here on this very early stage of this lip texture study. I'm applying a thin glaze on the lower left-hand side of this texture just to knock back some of the values. And just to test out the cone shape of that spray pattern, I'm spraying in a large continuous line here. And it seems to be spraying absolutely fine, so that slightly off-center nozzle isn't having much of an effect here, if any at all. But for that price of closer to $200 US, I would have liked to have seen that nozzle perfectly centered the way I see it in my other GREX airbrush. It's not a criticism at all, but I found the price on this airbrush to be a bit on the higher side. You do get a bunch of extras for that price tag, and GREX makes a very nice airbrush. That nozzle alignment and the bottom of the paint cups are my only points of concern here. But again, the airbrush does spray great. It's fantastic atomization. It's a very responsive and sensitive trigger. So that's going to be my review of this GREX Tritium airbrush. I hope that some of you out there found it useful. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you back here next Friday.